Hey, HannahMouse1 here. Welcome to another devlog for A Farmer's Life, the farming game that I am making in Scratch. In this video, I made some music for the game and tidied up a few things as we steamroll towards the next update's release. So I started off in Soundtrap, which is a free online version of something like GarageBand and is what I use for all of my music in all of my games. Now, if you've seen some of my past videos, you probably know that making music is not my forte, and I have a pretty scrappy method for putting some passable tracks together. It starts with picking out an instrument that kind of fits the vibe that I want for the piece, then hitting random keys on the keyboard to create the main melody. I then used the piano reel to physically shape and manipulate these notes to make them more appealing to the ear, and then added more instruments to create a certain atmosphere. For instance, the quarry, I wanted a lonely, desolate, open feel, so I used a high bell-like sound for the main melody and didn't use any other instruments to make it feel more isolating. In contrast, the shop has multiple different instruments to create a more familiar feel. The instruments and sounds that I chose also reflected the atmosphere or vibes of the place where they play. So in the track that plays in the blacksmith, there's a rhythmic drum beat and a high metallic ting to try and subtly invoke the idea of a hammer striking an anvil, and the hardware store used a synth based on Foley sounds to create a sense of practicality or physicality that I associate with DIY. Or for a few tracks I would try and consider what genre of music fit the atmosphere. So for the barn I chose instruments that I would associate with Western music, as that's a genre that I connect with animal ranchers. I created tracks for the quarry, the blacksmith, the shop, the hardware store, the lab and the barn. Only one for each for now, but I hope that there being a different track for each location will add some much needed variety. Now, back in Scratch, I made a sprite to handle all of the music. This generates a clone whenever the location switches to someone with a new track. The appropriate track fades into the appropriate volume in accordance with the volume variable and loops it until the player goes to a new location. When this happens, the volume fades back out and the clone deletes. There were a couple of considerations and edge cases. For example, if the player goes to the map or the inventory or anything like that, the current track had to keep playing. To do this, I added all of the pages where the same track should continue to a list and had the clone check to see if the open page was on said list before deleting. Another edge case was the request board, which doesn't have its own track, so instead plays the same track as the farm. This was another quick check just to make certain when the track needed to delete and continue. So then I added sounds to all the new systems, so the UI for the building menu in the hardware store, the barn, everything to do with the animals, etc, etc. This was honestly just a lot of copy pasting code that I'd done before, so it was easy and honestly a quite relaxing process. I also created an effect for the build tab where if you can't build the new building, the items you're missing or the money if you can't afford it jitter slightly to draw your attention to what you're missing and hopefully create a more responsive feel that doesn't leave the player wondering what they did wrong. I then remembered that I had revamped the lab UI since the last update and therefore needed to implement some new sound effects for that. And then something that I'd been kind of putting off, updating the save load function to accommodate all the new elements of the game. I had to make it so that the save code included any new variables and lists that I had since added and that the loading function can then cycle through this to set the lists correctly. I've tried to make this backwards compatible, so hopefully you'll be able to use codes from version 1 of the game in the new version, but I haven't tested this yet. It basically checks the first letter of the code, which is an ID dependent on the version of the game it was saved in, and if it's 0 instead of 1, it fills all the variables and lists as though it's a new game. And now the code ends in a V instead of a Q, so I had to change a piece of UI that tells you whether or not you've correctly copied the entire code. And finally, another thing that I've been really procrastinating on is updating the art for the start menu. Basically, it's one of the few elements that haven't brought up to the new art style, and it's something that really needs to change before the next update. I'm still happy with the general layout though, and I wanted to keep that the same. I started with trying to edit the existing costumes, but I eventually realised it was just easier to remake the costumes from scratch, using the old ones as a reference for the general placement of the various elements. It just involved a lot of rounding off corners and shading for the most part. I also added in Bridget, the new NPC, to the screen, with her reaction on being clicked to raise her hand to her ears, though she can't really hear very well, because bless her, she's getting on in the years and her hearing's going a bit. I also updated the thumbnail with new art and changed the V1 text to V2 animals update. For the next 2 weeks I'm just going to do some playtesting and bug fixing, and I'll hopefully have a new build for you before the next devlog, so keep an eye out for that. Other than that, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. It lets me know that this is something you want to see more of. There's a link to the channel Discord in the description if you're interested in joining this little community. You'll get front row access to any progress, updates or projects that I've got underway, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!